So Professor Silvertown is Professor of Evolutionary Ecology at the University of Edinburgh and is a member of the Botanical Society. He has written a lot of papers on population biology of plants and 8 books, including most recently, The Comedy of Error, Why Evolution Made Us Laugh. He started thinking about the subject of this talk while researching his next book, which is a cooperative history of life entitled Teams of Rivals, How Selfish Genes Make Social Beings. So I'd like to welcome Professor Silvertown to start his lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jill. It's a pleasure to be giving this talk. I was hoping, like perhaps a number of us were, that this would be in person. But, you know, before too long, let's hope. So this is a very informal talk. I'm not going to be talking about any research I've done in the last 30 years. I'm going to mention something I did even earlier than that. But basically, it's a chance for us all to think about, I suppose, how botany is perceived out there at the moment and what people are saying about plants and whether we agree with it. So it's also supposed to be a bit of fun. So what kick-started me on this idea was seeing this book, The Hidden Life of Trees, on the left by Peter Wollben. It's been phenomenally successful. In fact, it's part of a series. And Peter Wollben is a German forester. I was in the Black Forest at the weekend. They have a lot of forest. It's lovely. So that's his background. And he writes charmingly, but very anthropomorphically about trees. And the thing that pulled me up short was him talking about trees being friends of each other, because the research I've done in forests suggests quite the reverse. Then there's this book by Susan Simard, who is an ecologist, called Finding the Mother Tree. And what you see on the cover there are western red cedars. She works on the west coast of the US and up in British Columbia. And I'll mention something about her a bit later, but this book, which is out recently, is a kind of biography incorporating her stories of her life and her experiments. But essentially, she regards trees also as being rather kind to each other. So, in fact, there are a lot of books relevant to this now. It's extraordinary. Down the bottom there, you see Plant Behaviour and Intelligence by Professor Tony Chihuahuas, who is emeritus at the University of Edinburgh. Plant-Animal Communication. Revolutionary Genius of Plants, Plant Sensing and Communication, which is a book well worth reading. The Language of Plants, Brilliant Green. So those two and Revolutionary Genius of Plants are by a bunch of people who call themselves plant neurobiologists. And then at the top is What a Plant Knows by Danny Chamovitz, and he's a proper plants physiologist. That book was extremely successful, and it's interesting, very good, but doesn't contain anything particularly controversial, I don't think. Okay, so what are the claims for plants by people who we're talking about? So first of all, that plants have senses. So I don't think that's controversial. We'll have a little look at that in just a moment. Then that plants communicate. Okay, so here we have to ask ourselves, what do we mean by communication? And we'll do that. And then plants are intelligent. So this is something that Tony Chihuahuas has been plugging for a long time. He's no longer alone in regarding plants as intelligent. And then plants help each other. So we'll look at all those propositions. The one we're not going to look at is the idea that plants are intelligent. And the reason is the following, that in Tony's paper in Nature, exactly 20 years ago, he defined intelligence as follows. In plants, behavioral plasticity by the individual is where intelligence should be apparent. So he's basically equating plasticity of plants, them changing, for example, leaf shape, the length of nodes, all those kinds of things, the positioning of leaves, in response to the environment as intelligence. So whether you agree with that or not, I don't personally think it really adds anything to our understanding of plants to call that intelligent. So I'm not going to say anything intelligent or otherwise about plant intelligence. We're going to leave that one out. And what we're going to start off by doing is polling you, all of you who are watching, to find out what you think about plants being friends now. And then we're going to do the same thing when I've finished, and we'll compare the two numbers just for a bit of fun. Who knows? Possibly there'll be no change. Maybe I'll have changed your mind. I don't know. We'll see. Okay, so could we, Julia, could we have the poll, please? Right, there it is. It says pre-lecture survey before the lecture, can plants be friends? So you need to choose one of those. Please do that now. And Julia will record the numbers privately and stop the poll when she thinks she's got enough answers. So don't spend too long thinking about it. I guess we should have some music playing right now. Okay, great. So I have no idea what the results are. I'm fascinated to find out. We'll see. Okay, so I've created a little sort of breadcrumb trail down the bottom of the screen there for you. And essentially the questions are, do plants sense? Do they communicate? I've already told you I'm not going to say anything about intelligence. And then do they help each other, which is the sort of friendly bit. Okay. So I first thought about this subject, 33 years ago, and published this paper in Annual Review of Ecology and Systematics with a behavioural ecologist called Deborah Gordon, who at the time was in Oxford and is now in Stanford. And she studies ants. And I'm going to tell you what we said in the paper in just a moment, but the reception of the paper was very interesting. Basically, plant people ignored it completely. And Deborah told me later that she was at a conference on animal behavior. And somebody said to her, Deborah, have you seen that ludicrous paper by Silvertown in Annual Reviews in Ecology and Systematics? He says that plants behave. And she replied, I have seen it. I'm the other author. At which the guy, of course, looked embarrassed. And that was the end of the conversation. Well, since then, the idea that plants behave has become a lot more mainstream. I mean, I've shown you some of the books that discuss it, and I've moved on. So this is really my first return to this subject for 30 years. Hopefully, I've got something new to say, but I'm not so sure about that. But anyway, here we go. So what we did in this paper, we tried to think what the limits of plant behavior would be. So we defined plant behavior essentially the way that Tony Chihuahua defines intelligence, which is basically a response to some change in the environment. So you could call this plasticity. And plants have limited ability to move. They can move, but they have limited ability to move. Most of their changes involve producing a new organ that's different from the other organs, and perhaps placed in a different place, different size, or of course, switching between organs, so from leaves to stems to flowers and so on. So what we tried to do was to think of two gradients. One would be the one I've shown at the bottom here, which is the ability of plants to sense things. So we call this the sensibility axis. And on the vertical axis is the ability of plants to respond, their capability axis. Okay, these are terms that haven't caught on, so you can forget them immediately. We change slides. But it's useful actually just to give you an idea about sort of what plants can and maybe can't do. So if you look at the bottom left-hand corner box, you've got light intensity, growth in response to light intensity. So, and I've written etiolation there. Okay, so we're all familiar with what happens when you try and grow your tomato plants on the windowsill and there's not enough light. They etiolate and then they fall over. That is a behavioral response. It's the plant trying to reach the light when there isn't enough. Okay, so I think that's entirely uncontroversial. Then we have something slightly more sophisticated. This is heliotropism in sunflowers. And this is in response to a gradient. Okay, so actually what happens in the bud, it doesn't happen in the flowers. So it's a myth that sunflowers turn their flowers with the sun during the day. They don't do that. They turn the bud with the sun. As it tracking the sun across the sky. But once the flowers open, they are set in the direction of the rising sun, I think, usually. So, but that's heliotropism. So again, that's kosher. It's even got a tropism name. It's orientation in response to a light gradient. Then you've got shade avoidance. So this is plants avoiding each other usually. Not sticking a branch into somebody else's canopy, not out of friendliness, but simply because there's less light there. And a lot of this happens in response to red-far red ratio. So leaves, of course, absorb red light. Relatively speaking, they transmit far red light, so the ratio changes when light has passed through a leaf, and plants use phytochrome to sense when this has happened, and then they respond accordingly. And not only do leaves do this response, but also so do seeds. So lettuce seeds, for example, if you do an experiment and try germinating them under a leaf, you can do this in a Petri dish. It's a nice little experiment to do. They won't germinate. But if you simply take the leaf away, even if the light level is the same, they will then germinate. That's because they're sensitive to this red-far red ratio. And that's telling the plant, don't germinate. There's a leaf over the top. You probably die if you do. So this is an example of the kind of behaviors that we're all familiar with and how they map onto this space of what plants can sense and how plants can respond. And those are behaviors according to Deborah and myself and probably many others. But let's look at what happens outside that range of capability and sensibility. At the time, and I think probably with 30 years more research, one would find examples that fit in these grey areas. But the idea was that actually plants don't do these things you find in here. So top left, you'll see communication. Okay, so do plants communicate in response to light intensity or light gradient or light quality or the pattern of light? Do they perceive, for example, light flecks and then in a forest and then communicate that? We didn't think so, and so on. So I think that's quite useful, even though nobody else seems to have done. And it is referred to occasionally, but generally speaking, people are making claims in these what I've called grey areas about plants doing much more daring things than Deborah or I could conceive. So let's look at what plant communication is. Well, actually, this isn't just plant communication. This is communication full stop. So this is definition given by Richard Carban in his book, Plant Sensing and Communication. And this is one of the non-flaky books on this topic. Well worth reading, good, solid science. And so basically you've got a sender and a receiver. The sender emits something, so it might be a change in wavelength or it might be a volatile compound, and that constitutes a cue or a signal, but it's really only a cue or a signal if it's perceived by a receiver, by another plant in the cases we're talking about. But you could substitute for the sender, receiver, and so on, you and I, if you wanted to. This applies to any organisms that are communicating, transmitting information. The receiver then processes the information and responds. Okay, so that's the process. And what we have to ask ourselves is whether plants do all these different things in any particular case where communication is claimed. And for this to be true communication, in the sense that it's evolved as a means of transferring information from sender to receiver and potentially back again, this has to confer advantage on both the sender and the receiver. Okay, so you may think that's overly restrictive, but there are, and we can discuss that. That's one of the things we can talk about later. I'm hoping to leave plenty of time for discussion. So, okay. And John Maynard Smith and David Harper wrote this book called Animal Signals, in which they talk about this, if you want to follow that up. So do plants communicate? Well, if you look at what they can sense, this is a recent paper in the Plant Journal, and it nicely illustrates all the ways in which plants emit signals and cues which are sensed by other plants. So on the right, you've got the neighbor plant. On the left, you've got what's called the focal plant. And you can see that the perception. So phytochrome, which I already mentioned, essentially enables plants to sense the red ratio. And you can see here that on the neighbor plant, that ratio is changed by going through a leaf. And other plants can sense that and say, aha, there's a neighbor. And they can do that for plants that are around about them, as well as the plants that are over the top. So they actually can sense their neighbors, even if their neighbors are not taller than they are. And then you've got all sorts of chemical signals that go on, including signals that are emitted, or rather chemicals that are emitted when a plant is damaged, particularly by insects and things like that. And other plants can pick that up. And then you've got the sort of signaling that goes on back at a biochemical level between parasitic plants and their hosts. Basically, all parasites have to find a kind of biochemical key to find their way into the cells or the vascular system of their host. So that definitely involves molecular communication, and so on. So I don't need to go through the whole thing, but we can say without any shadow of doubt that plants do sense all sorts of things in the environment, and some of those cues come from other plants. Okay, so fine, that's good. So signals, perfectly good. Right, so let's have a look at this thing called the common mycorrhizal network. So one of the things that Wal Ben and Susan Simard and others have got very excited about is the idea that the ectomycorrhizal network in the soil, and I expressly point out this is the ectomycorrhizal fungi and not the arbuscular fungi. So these are the ones that form a sheath over the outside of the root. They actually form a conduit of communication and also substances, resources from one plant to another. So it's been demonstrated that you can get inducible resistance in plants. So a neighboring plant can sense that another one has been attacked, and the volatile organic compounds, VOCs, emitted by the damaged plant are transmitted not only through the air, but they can also apparently be transmitted through the common mycorrhizal network. So this is something that certainly progressed greatly. Understanding of this is something that progressed greatly in the last 30 years, and it's really interesting. But is it communication? Okay, so remember, it's got to be of benefit to be true communication. It's got to be of benefit to both parties. Well, you can see why it would be of benefit to the receiver to know that a neighbor has been attacked. But why is it of a benefit to the transmitter? Is it just eavesdropping and saying, "Oh God, I could. There's blood in that. There's blood out there. I got to get protected." Or what? Is there actually some kind of a friendly signaling going on between the plant on the left and the plant on the right? Okay. So if not, then there's no communication in the strict sense. Now, I suspect the people who write the books I've been discussing, the more popular ones, will actually say, well, it doesn't need to be evolved to communicate. Okay, so that's something we can discuss to be communication. So we can discuss that if you like. But I'm an evolutionary biologist, and for me, it's got to have evolved. Okay. So now let's look at the types of interaction between plants and think about what benefit means. Okay, so within a species, you can have this. If you've done any kind of biology, you'll be very familiar with, or ecology, you'll be very familiar with this kind of little table. So you've got the effect on the actor. Is it nothing? Is it positive or is it negative? And the effect on the recipient of the interaction. And this can be any kind of interaction. It doesn't have to be communication necessarily. And the ones we're interested in, if we're talking about plants being friends, are these ones, which are positive for the recipient, okay? And for it to be true communication, it's really got to be positive for both the actor or the transmitter, if you like, and the recipient. So an example of that would be the Alley effect, named after an animal ecologist writing in the 1930s, I think it was, called Alley. And he basically said there are many situations among animals when having having a crowd is a good thing. Okay, so it's not all competition when you get more individuals. Actually, there are things which go better when you have a crowd. Sex would be one of them. Finding a mate is a lot easier in a crowd. Defending yourself against natural enemies. Buffaloes, herd together when there are predators around, and so on. So those happen for sure in animals. Do they happen in plants? And essentially the same thing can be thought of in between species interactions, but the plus here we would call mutualism, a form of symbiosis. So I'm rattling through this. I'm assuming you're pretty familiar with this kind of thing. So the first thing I want to say about those interactions is that competition between plants is intense. So this is a study that I conducted in the Adirondacks. This is a pretty much pure stand of balsam fir, which we're studying for reasons I won't go into. But what you can see is the place is chocker with small trees. And the mortality in this forest is absolutely stupendous. It is totally impossible for all those small trees to grow up to be big. Look how close they are together. So foresters have this thing they call the thinning law, and they actually use it to work out what stocks they should put into a forest and what spacing they should use and all this kind of thing. And it basically says that if you have lots of trees, they're going to die at a very predictable rate. So at the point of seeds hitting the ground in this forest, you can get 10,000 seedlings per square meter, 10,000. So you would be lucky to get one mature tree per square meter. So that gives you an idea about how much plant mortality occurs. And this is largely trees killing trees. How do they do it? Well, they simply grow taller than their neighbors, they shade them, and the little ones die because they have no light and their roots don't develop and they don't get any nutrients from the soil either. So this is the norm. It's more complicated than that. Obviously there are entire ecology courses on this topic. I've written books about this, but essentially, if you want to know what goes on in forests, it's an awful lot of trees killing trees. So that immediately, knowing that, having seen that, and if you think about it, it's kind of obvious, immediately makes me suspicious of anybody who says that trees are friends. Okay, I'm going to leave that there and let's move on. Here is some very nice evidence which shows that what I talked about just now doesn't always happen. So this is a beautiful study, really so simple, but just very clear, done by Ragg and Calloway and a whole load of other people. And they did a really simple experiment, which was they took focal plants in natural vegetation and in the alpine habitats and then lower elevations, and they removed the plants around the focal plant. And they had controls where, of course, they hadn't removed the neighboring plants. And they did this at high elevation and at low elevation. So what you can see on the vertical axis is that whether plants produce, what proportion, what percentage produced flowers or fruit. And at low elevation, if you remove the neighbors, plants do better, okay? But at high elevation, if you remove the neighbors, the controls, that is the plants that still have neighbors, they do better. So basically, it's good to have neighbors when the environment is very harsh, and it's not so good to have neighbors when there's lots of resources, a long growing season, and everybody's competing for light and resources. However, this was, I think, done with herbs and in many different places. So, I mean, it's a pretty wide study. But what I showed you just now, the balsam fir, that is in the subalpine. So the story for here is this is basically between species, and within species, you can still get massive mortality, even in high elevation forests. So I'm an ecologist. I have to tell you it's complicated. There you go, it's complicated, but in a sort of predictable way. So let's now think about 3 ways in which trees may help each other and ask whether they're friendly or not. So the first one is carbon transfer via the wood wide web. So if you haven't heard of that, I'll show you what it looks like in just a moment. Root grafts. Trees hold hands or hold roots beneath the soil. How friendly is that? What's going on? And then hydraulic redistribution. Trees share water. Surely that's friendly, isn't it? Okay, let's have a look at each one of these in turn. And in each case, we can ask whether the help is mutually beneficial or only benefits the recipient. Okay, so this is a very nice study by Susan Simard and her colleagues in 2010. This isn't the original study that made her famous. It's one of the ones that she followed up with. And what they used genomics basically to track which trees, shown by the green star shapes, were connected to which other trees. They're all Douglas firs. They all belong to the same species. By mycorrhizal fungi, and the fungi varied in genotype, so it was possible to say. And so that tree down the bottom with the black arrow is connected to 47 other trees through 11 genotypes of the 2 different species of mycorrhizal fungi in this site. So this is what David Reed, writing in Nature, called the wood wide web. These are ectomycorrhizal fungi. It's believed that this doesn't happen with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, which are by far the most common kind of mycorrhizal fungus. But they're much more discrete and less connecting. So what's interesting is that, what I'm showing you is a graph from a figure from the original study of 2010, and the same research team went back some 10 years later and looked at the growth of plants that were well connected and plants that were less well connected. And they found that in the case of one of the fungi connecting the trees that were more connected had grown better than the trees that were less well connected. But in case of the other fungus, that didn't happen. Right. So the point here is that, and this criticism has been made of this kind of work ever since it started back in the 90s, is that actually what's going on here is not the trees helping each other by moving resources around, carbohydrates largely probably, and maybe some nitrogen, but it's actually the fungi, which after all have evolved and are not just conduits, but are living organisms. It's the fungi that are moving things around. And so what they tend to do is to move carbohydrate from source to sink, because what they're looking for in exchange with the trees, their symbionts, is to get carbohydrate back. And if a plant is not producing much, they need to beef up the amount of carbohydrate in that part of the mycorrhizal system. So as far as I'm aware, and somebody listening may know more about this than I do, very likely, as far as I am aware, the criticism that what's going on in the Wood Wide Web is controlled by the fungi has not really been fully answered. Okay, so whether we can conclude that this is trees helping each other out or simply the fungi doing stuff that looks like that is not entirely clear at the moment. Okay, so now let's look at root grafts, and this is where you can see alley effects. So a single tree with no neighbours is liable to be blown over, forest tree, but if they're all connected underground, you can imagine that forms a stable platform. So that's a clear advantage to joining up with your neighbours, and it's of mutual benefit. Okay, so whether you call that friendly or not is neither here nor there, but I think it's unhelpful to call it that. It could be misunderstood. Let's just say that these are alley effects, the effects of being numerous. The effects the connections can be clonal. So in the photograph in A, the trees on the left and the stems on the right are basically the same organism. And on the right-hand side, they are actually grafted. Now, what's interesting is that grafts transfer resources even after one of the trees is killed. So here we go, or at least chopped down. So this is a very nice little study. It's only of one pair of trees, but it doesn't matter for these purposes. And what they did was it was in New Zealand, they looked at this kauri tree, and the neighbor on the left has been chopped down, but it still has an intact root system. And the one on the right is an intact tree. And basically what happens is during the day, water goes from the stump to the intact tree. And then at night, as you can see on the right-hand side, basically it kind of reverses. The tree is no longer transpiring, but the living stump is still drawing in water. So I've circled in orange the words living stump benefits. Okay, so to an evolutionary biologist, to say that a tree that is just a bunch of roots connected to something else with roots is benefiting in some sense is not very convincing. This is not something that will allow the stump to produce offspring and spread its genes into the future generation. So it may benefit in the hydraulic sense. It may be kept alive in that sense, but it's not a benefit that can have evolved through the tree that's been chopped down. Okay, so this would be where I would part company with Peter Wolben, who actually said, trees are so amazing, they even keep their neighbors alive when they're chopped down. Yes, they do, but you can see there are advantages to doing that for the tree that's remaining. It basically now has, through root grafting, an extended root system. It has two root systems for the price of one, and no competition from the leaves of the chopped down tree. So is that friendly? Well, you decide. Okay, and then thirdly, here's another thing which definitely looks friendly at first sight. So you have this extraordinary phenomenon that occurs particularly in dry areas called hydraulic lift or hydraulic redistribution, in which trees during the daytime, big trees, pull up water from depth if they have deep roots. And then at night, they leak it out into the surroundings. And of course, other plants then benefit. So if anything looked friendly, that does. But it turns out that this is actually of advantage to the tree that is sharing its water, because what happens is the vegetation around the tree acts as a kind of storage sponge. So although there are benefits to the plants around about, there are also benefits to the focal tree in spilling water out. It appears to be, I mean, it would be logical that it's doing that in quotes deliberately, because it's actually to its advantage. It increases the soil moisture content overall throughout the day. So again, is that friendly or is that just ecology? You decide. So Julia, we're going to have our second poll.
Hey, Jonathan,
Yes.
We've got the answers more or less. So
Fantastic.
before your lecture,
Yeah.
we had 50% of people saying yes, 26% saying no, and I don't know, 23%. So the no's and the I don't knows were pretty equal.
Right.
Now we've got 38% saying yes, and no's are 31, and I don't know's are 31. So you've introduced more doubt into the audience than was there before.
Well, I regard that as positive, actually. Yeah. So skepticism. We should all be skeptical, shouldn't we? And look for evidence. So that's great. Okay. Thank you very much. Now I think we'll have some questions if you have any.
Yes, Jonathan, there's been quite a few comments here, in particular from Trevor Fenning. I don't know if we could ask Julia to let Trevor speak, and then he might be able to go through some of these comments himself rather than me try and summarize what he's talking about.
Okay.
While other people write some questions in the chat.
I will allow Trevor to talk. Okay. Here he is, hopefully.
Hello, Trevor.
Hello, I'm here.
Hi, Trevor.
Yeah, it kind of all sort of hinges on what you mean by friends, I guess.
Yeah.
Plants cooperate because it's in their interest to do so, as you kind of hinted. They listen to what each other are doing and act accordingly, and they sort of take note of that and adjust their behaviour. But it's very sophisticated, but I wouldn't necessarily call it friendly. Higher plant behaviour is highly nuanced and highly adapted. I'm sure we don't understand half of it, but it's quite hard to sort of describe it in sort of human words. But they kind of live in a different environment to us, and it's hard to sort of put it in our terms really, because they're living such a different life to us.
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, I think it's, we tend to be anthropomorphic. We have to use the language we're familiar with, particularly when writing popular accounts, so that people can understand what we're trying to say. And there's a great temptation to be sensationalist. I mean, it does sell books. I think we shouldn't believe our own metaphors necessarily. Literally.
So I'm not sure if that was a question, but it's just my thinking on it.
No, I agree with you. Yeah.
Thank you, Trevor. I don't know if we can save these all your comments, and we can send them on to Jonathan later, maybe, because you did give an example of bees and flowers are co-evolved and codependent. But it is in the interest of both parties to do so, but you wouldn't call them friends.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and they do communicate. I mean, that is communication. I don't think you can say that a flower I don't think you can deny that a flower with nectar guides and all those evolved things that attracts particular, or that is has a particular structure that attracts particular pollinators is not communicating its with pollinators. Obviously it is, and they both benefit.
Okay, thank you, Trevor. At the start of your lecture, John Grace queried whether it was to be friends with each other or friends with us. And I guess the rest of your talk suggested you were talking about friends amongst the plants. But I guess you could comment on whether you think they could be friends with us too.
I don't know. Yeah, I think, I meant, of course, John will appreciate, friends with each other. I was aware that it was slightly ambiguous and decided to leave it like that. I think the question's answered, really.
Yes. Doug Evans made a comment about below ground responses, water and nutrients. And I don't know at which point he said that, whether it was in response to something you were exactly saying or it was a question that you then answered. I don't know if Doug wants to say more. Can Doug be made to speak?
Yeah, I'm just doing that.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Doug, that's great. Good to see you here.
Thanks. It was before you mentioned mycorrhizae fungal, and so to some extent you maybe didn't discuss it in the way I would have done, but you did discuss it. So, I just as an aside, I thought it was interesting that you correctly made the point that this really only most of the relevant work is on ectomycorrhizal fungi, but the diagram you showed was arbuscular. So maybe if you do this again, it might be.
Really, was it?
Well, I suspect it was. I mean, it's difficult to say. But ectomycorrhizal are mostly with woody plants, and those look like herbs.
The graph I showed with Douglas fir, that was obviously.
No, there was.
Before that, yeah.
Carbon,
Your picture of neighbours, maybe. Picture of neighbours.
That one, yeah. That's actually meant to be. I see it. Yeah, that is meant to be ectos.
Yeah, you talked about ectos, but I don't think they would have been in that.
Actually, you're right. You're absolutely right. So I think we need to write to Whips et al. In New Phytologist and say this is very confusing.
Blame him.
Yeah.
Yes.
The other point while I'm talking, with your, I mean, I don't know enough about this study, but with your New Zealand study with the stump which stayed alive.
Yeah.
Now, if that tree is a tree which is able to coppice, keeping it alive for maybe a year while it then can coppice could actually be a benefit to the second tree. But I don't know whether the trees in question can coppice.
You're right. I don't know either. Yeah.
Yes, I was going to comment on that same thing because in Puerto Rico, there's a tree that root grafts and the stumps do stay alive and they do develop callus and they do grow sprouts. They don't generally survive for very long, but they're obviously getting resources from the still alive tree. The stump is so low in the canopy that's broken off that it doesn't get enough light and doesn't become self-supporting.
Well,
theoretically,
that's what I would have thought. Yes. Yeah.
But theoretically, it could do that. And there's some Cecropia trees in that forest as well, where the root grafting does work and they do stay alive for a very long time. And if they then end up in a light gap, they do take off again. So there is definitely a benefit there.
Yeah.
Maria Chamberlain was saying about a study that was done a few years ago on tropical plants growing in forests, and the different species flowered at different times so as to keep the pollinators satisfied for longer. Is that cooperation between the different species and the pollinators?
Well, I don't think everything that involves benefit is necessarily evolved cooperation, because for a start, when you've got lots of species, there are so many factors involved in what would be called community assembly, in putting together which species are present and which ones are not, both for the plants and for the insects, assuming these are insect pollinators. And also, how would it evolve if you had multiple species? So I would want to call it something else, really, I think. I mean, when talking about complexity in ecological systems, the model suggests that the most stable ecosystems are those where there are weak links with alternative species that can provide pollination or whatever it might be. So yeah, it's an interesting question, Maria. And I don't think I'd put it in the class of phenomena that we were discussing today.
There's one of the things I was thinking, that the plants might have evolved to flower at different times because they didn't have successful reproduction if they all flowered at the same time, because there was more pollinators went to one species than the other. So they could have evolved a different temporal phenology. Trevor's following up now. He's obviously thinking about this a great deal. And he was talking about a study a few years ago with African acacias growing in the savannah, where it was shown that the big trees kill the smaller ones, creating zones of clearance around them. And David Attenborough showed this in his Secret Life of Plants series and suggested it was caused by elephants. It's not the elephants as the trees do it themselves, even in the absence of elephants.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, allelopathy, which is the production of poisons by plants, walnut's an obvious one. Nothing will grow near a walnut. It's partly the dense shade, but also there are chemicals produced that are toxic to other plants, apparently. I mean, there's a whole lot of interactions going on.
There's a study that might be interesting to do is looking at how closely related neighborhood trees are. And because you would think that if they were grafting and you were a close relative, then your genetic profile could go on in the future through reproduction. And if they were not close, near neighbors, not genetically related, then they might be more likely to have competition.
Yes. Well, so many trees are clonal. So the Western red cedars, which I mentioned at the very beginning and are on the cover of Susan Simard's book, I've seen those in the field, in forest, and they huge trees can grow so close together that you couldn't put another tree between them. You could put another trunk between them. Okay, so two big trunks so close that they almost touch. And at the time I saw it, I thought, what on earth is going on here? How come, one tree hasn't actually outcompeted the other? And the answer is actually that Western red cedars clone. So when you see two trunks that close together, it's probably the same tree. It's probably one tree connected underground. And so that's a bit like saying your left leg and your right leg are friends. Right? Mm-hmm. I mean, they're connected. Only the other way about. Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay, well, it's a fascinating talk and obviously much to think about, for the future. And we look forward to seeing your new book. And thank you very much for giving this talk this evening. I'm sure people can contact you later with further questions as things pop into their mind. But that's very interesting, and very pleased that we